We interviewed the police officers who had to go down to Russell Square, and they had to, sort of on their hands and knees in the intense heat and extraordinary sort of dust and smells, they had to fingertip search the whole bomb site and pick up each of the body parts that had been blown apart.
It's 20 years today since the 7/7 bombings, in which 52 people were killed and hundreds injured when improvised explosive devices were detonated on 3 London Underground trains and on a bus. It was the first ever suicide bomb attack in Western Europe, and it permanently changed the way the British state viewed and dealt with terrorism. The horror of that day and the frenzied political and pivotal weeks that followed are chronicled in a new book, 3 Weeks in July, written by the filmmaker Adam Wishart and the crime journalist James Nally. And Adam Wishart joins me now. Look, on that day, it wasn't initially totally clear what had happened. We were told about some kind of power outage on the tube. How did the news gradually emerge about what was going on?
Well, I think it's, one thing to remember about the day is it's important. Like, now we know that it was 4 bombs and they were suicide bombers. But at the time, first of all, London Transport thought it was a power outage. There was some kind of electrical explosion. That was the news that they were putting out. And then at 9:50, when the bus blew up, everybody understood it was terrorism. But even at that point, nobody knew, and the police and the security state and the British state didn't know if these were suicide bombers and that was it, or if there was a wider network. Maybe just the year before, the bombers in Madrid had dropped off bags and it exploded. So was this the first wave of a series of bombs that was going to come and wreck London in the coming weeks?
And where was Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, and what did he do first?
Tony Blair was... he first heard about the news when he was in a meeting with the Chinese Premier in Gleneagles. It was the G8. And pretty soon he got on a helicopter and flew south to London. And... I mean, it was different to George W. Bush on 9/11. In George W. 11, it came on 9/11. It came out of a kind of clear blue sky. It was entirely surprising. Whereas by 2005, people understood that this kind of attack was likely to happen. Just the previous weekend, there had been a tabletop exercise where people had been preparing for it. So the sort of the mechanics of how the state responded was put in motion pretty quickly. But to kind of oversee it, Tony Blair came south to be in Downing Street. And
look, the Met Police are remembered as over the weeks that followed and not necessarily covering themselves in glory. The wrong man was shot on the tube, for example. How did they respond in the sort of immediate aftermath?
Well, they really needed to know who did it, because if they didn't find out who did it, maybe they'll do it again. And so... first of all, and to find that, they needed evidence, and the evidence was either going to come from the forensic scenes or from the CCTV. So they went to the CCTV, they went to the scenes at the 4 bomb sites. But part of the problem was that, bombs had wrecked the structure of London tubes, and so they needed to photograph the scenes first, and then they needed to make sure they were structurally safe. And so it took a while for the forensics examiners to get down into the Russell Square, Edgware Road and Aldgate to find out what was going on. And slowly, in the course of the coming days, they found identity documents of some of the bombers, which led them to Beeston in West Yorkshire.
How did it change our understanding in Britain of the terrorist threat? Because I'm talking about this earlier. One of our guests pointed out that although we'd known there was theoretically a sort of an Islamist terrorist threat in Britain, because it hadn't sort of happened post 9/11, people had started to become quite sceptical about it.
Well, I think for the police and MI5, they knew very straightforwardly there was a Islamist threat. Like the previous year, Operation Crevice had stopped a network of bombers that were going to bomb Bluewater and other places in Britain. But these crimes hadn't yet been prosecuted, and so it wasn't in the public consciousness. People weren't aware of it. And so just a few months before 7/7, Tony Blair was introducing an anti-terrorism bill. And people were saying this is just exaggeration, there's no need for it. But obviously, as soon as it happened, we understood that suicide bombers and the Islamist threat was real and present. And there was a series of laws that were enacted, and MI5 was funded to a greater extent.
You spoke to some survivors who formed a kind of a 7/7 club. Tell us about some of their experiences.
Well, Martin Wright, for example, was on the tube at Aldgate. She had a new pair of trainers that she had bought the previous week, and she remembers just this intense blackness and then realising that her new trainers were somehow up in the sky, somehow detached from her body. And she didn't really discover the reason until she woke up from a coma 8 days later.
Wow, gosh. Yeah, I mean, you must have had a variety of testimonies like this.
Yeah, it was extraordinary, really. I mean, I think it's difficult to imagine what it's like to be at the heart of one of these events, to see, to both to be a survivor, but also, we interviewed the police officers who had to go down to Russell Square, and they had to sort of on their hands and knees in the intense heat and extraordinary sort of dust and smells. They had to fingertip search the whole bomb site and pick up each of the body parts that had been blown apart.
Do you think the police would think back on that time as regarding them? Should we indeed regard them as having done a good job over the preceding weeks? The following weeks.
We interviewed Brian Paddock, who was like the assistant commissioner at the time, and he said it demonstrates both the best of the police and the worst of them. So on the one hand, like a huge numbers, hundreds of people, incredibly diligent, working in the sort of belly of the state to find out who did this, to protect us as a nation. And then it went wrong when they shot an innocent man 2 weeks later, John Charles de Menendez. But the key sort of worst of it was in the days after the shooting, the Met police tried to sort of belittle John Charles. They said that he jumped over the barriers, that he behaved like a suicide bomber. They said that he had been challenged and didn't respond to police commands, which turned out not to be true, probably. And so that's the worst behaviour of the Metropolitan Police, trying to sort of manage their reputation before they look after the public.
And look, finally, Adam, I mean, looking at the years since then, although there have, of course, we were talking about this earlier, there have, of course, been Islamist terror attacks in the United Kingdom, including, we're sitting here in London Bridge, one literally just over there. There's never again been anything quite like this. Should we understand that as being a success of the police and the security services, or have we just got lucky?
I think broadly, we can understand it as a success. A year later, there was the liquid bomb plot. Islamist terrorists were going to put liquid bombs on planes across the Atlantic, which would have devastating consequences, but it was stopped because of a surveillance, a surveillance operation. And even in London Bridge, the attacks that have happened since are quite lone bombers. They're not like big networks, informed and educated from abroad. So to some extent, the state has been successful in stopping Islamist terrorists.
Thank you very much indeed, Adam Wishart. And 3 weeks in July, 7/7, The Aftermath and the Deadly Manhunt by Adam Wishart and James Nally is out now.